Welcome to a special Digging for Kryptonite double feature. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. This week, I'm pleased to present two conversations about a pair of comic book runs set in the style and continuity of other Superman adaptations. In the first half of this episode, we'll be discussing Superman 78 and its sequel, The Metal Curtain, which follow Superman the movie and Superman 2 starring Christopher Reeve. Then, in the second half of our double feature, we'll turn our attention to the Mark Millar run on Superman Adventures, the late 90s comic book series set in the world of Superman, the animated series. Hope you enjoy. I'm a proud backer of the Paragons of Earth comic book project, now available to support on Kickstarter. The creative team of Percival Constantine, Thomas DJ, and Eric Johns have plucked forgotten Golden Age superheroes from the public domain, reinvented them as their own sort of Justice League, and put them up against a Lovecraftian apocalypse. Back this project and learn more by going to percivalconstantine.com/paragons. Also, Perry, a multiple-time guest on Digging for Kryptonite, hosts the Superhero Cinephiles podcast about comic book-inspired films. Be sure to listen wherever you get podcasts. We reference the television series Smallville a lot around here, and there's one Smallville rewatch podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring tremendous insight, passion, and humor as they discuss each and every episode of the series that ushered in the renaissance of superhero TV. Listen to Always Hold On to Smallville wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On to banner, including Arrow, DC's Legends of Tomorrow, Superman and Lois, and Star Wars. Filmmakers and movie fans alike should be sure to attend these film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and Round Reel in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Take it from an alum of two of them. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts available via a shared universe network. Joining me to discuss the miniseries Superman 78, as well as its sequel, The Metal Curtain, is returning guest, Wearing the Cape cosplayer, Daniel Sanchez. Welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a joy to be asked to come back.
You were on the show for the first time at the beginning of 2023 in an episode appropriately titled Wearing the Cape, and we talked all about your Superman fan journey. And if anyone missed that episode, I highly encourage them to go back and take a listen to it. It was very moving, very emotional. You shared so much. Anyone who listened to that episode or has visited your Instagram profile or your Facebook profile knows clearly what an influence the Christopher Reeve iteration of Superman has been on you. So my big picture question before we get deeper into these two miniseries is simply, what has it meant to you over these past few years to have these two miniseries set in the style and continuity of the first two Christopher Reeve films? And then even more so to have the opportunity to meet and speak with the writer, Robert Venditti. Like, what has all of this meant to you?
I guess you'd have to frame it in this is something that we never thought would happen. So in a way, it's a gift that's even more special because it was so unassumed. We never thought, oh, give it enough time, someone will do this. It just wasn't a thought. And so for it to suddenly become something that could be in your hands, and then something that you could go look the YouTube videos up and see, well, what did everyone else think of it? And that part really brought me back to childhood when that's what you did. You know, you talked to the other neighborhood kids, what did you think of it? So first and foremost, that, experience of, I didn't even think that this would even happen. And then secondly, to be at a table at a convention, behind the table with Robert and Wilfredo, was something that I wouldn't have even dreamed that would happen. That's the next level of it. They're seeing Star Wars, and then there's hanging out with Mark Hamill for 3 days. There's maybe one is achievable, but the other, why would you even imagine it? And the conversations that I got to have with him that day and since that day, both of them have just really enriched every time I read these stories. That It's one of the reasons I wrote the article for the Daily Planet. It's one of the reasons I love talking about it in all interviews and chances that I get, is because I hope to give everyone else some of that same underpinning of appreciation.
That's wonderful. And speaking of that article, yes, you have an interview with Robert that's available at dailyplanetdc.com. People can read the interview, and then there's also the audio version that's embedded in the article as well. And it's really a treat. And just as your friend, I was so happy to see you have that opportunity. And it's a great piece, and I do encourage anyone to check it out if they haven't already. So these two miniseries that we're talking about, first we have Superman 78 by Robert Venditti and Wilfredo Torres, released in 2021 and 2022. And this introduced Brainiac and the Bottle City of Kandor to the world of the Christopher Reeve movie series. And then more recently, we had the sequel, The Metal Curtain, once again written by Robert Venditti, and this time drawn by new artist Gavin Guidry. And this released in 2023 and 2024. So as of this recording, very recently concluded. And this one dealt with a Russian Metallo. And I got to tell you, I got very, very strong Rocky IV vibes as I was reading this. And I say that with all the love in the world, and I say that as a huge compliment because I'm a massive Rocky fan, and that movie, of course, is iconic. So to kind of feel like I was in that space, I was very happy.
And I can tell you that was intentional. So one of the things that Robert wanted to do is be era appropriate as to when Donner movies would have come out if they had continued, and what the audience appetite might have been, what other movies were doing well in what genres. And the whole idea of a Cold War story, I grew up in that era. And so I remember there was the Rocky IV with Ivan Drago, I Must Break You. And there was Red Dawn. I mean, there were all of these. I mean, and even if you get Spies Like Us into the comedy genre, the idea of the USSR being, that's not even the Bond movies, but the idea of just in general, this ideological difference between us in quotes and them in quotes was something that Robert felt was fertile ground for how much more would that ideological difference have come into play if we had a living manifestation of our ideology. And so he very, very intentionally wanted to go in those waters.
It comes across on the page. The only thing that was missing was Superman standing on top of a mountain screaming, Metallo! Right? That's the only thing. I feel like that really would have brought it home. But no, the biggest and best compliment that I can give both of these miniseries, I guess the biggest one is that truly they do capture the spirit and the tone of those films, where you really do feel like you are in that world. And that's, of course, a combination of the writing and the art. But the other thing, more specifically, is that, to your point, they do feel like they could have been realized on screen in the late 70s, 80s, during the time period of the original series. Now, quite a while ago on this podcast, I'd have to go back and check exactly when it was, but it was a while ago, we did cover that first Superman 78 miniseries. So that episode is out there if anyone wants really a deep dive into those 6 issues. I do want to get your take on it, though. And I will say that I did reread that first miniseries in advance of this one. I have to say, my take on it remains the same, which is neither positive or negative, but I came away feeling the same way that I did the first time around. So I don't want to really rehash what I said in that episode, but I do want to toss it to you. Just your overall impressions of Superman 78 and how it's held up for you, and just kind of your reaction to what was presented to us in that story.
So I read them both fresh again today, just so it would be fresh. And my experience of series 1 is that I still every bit as much felt each character remained as if they had jumped right off screen. The intonations, the banter back and forth, their behaviors, I think, were so pitch perfect. Not only could you hear their voices in your head, but it did it without paying too much fan service. It wasn't just giving you your favorite quotes in a new environment. It really was continuing these people that you have known and loved. And it did it in a way where and Robert has said this is set after Superman 2, before Superman 3. So it has a foothold in time. And so the idea that there were more adventures in there were something that to me is still fresh coming off the page. And it's very rereadable. I think it's one of these that I could go back to and start on page one and just have a smile, like as if I had just popped in the DVD of Superman 2. It's that same, I'm going to revisit this as something that just makes me happy.
Right on. I'm glad you brought up when this is set, because I know that has been or had been a question among fans. Exactly when within the series do these stories take place? And as you have said, and it's in that interview that you conducted with Robert, that he's confirmed that these stories are meant to be following Superman 2, the theatrical cut, right?
Yes. Yes.
Because you always have to specify. But then and now, I think Brainiac truly was such a great choice of villain for that story, because it's the character that I feel has been begging to be done on the big screen. We have had small screen versions, but to be done on the big screen. And so I think in terms of choice of villain, it was really spot on. And I also I feel like there was a more sympathetic, might be too strong a word, but a slightly more sympathetic take on Brainiac, because we've seen other iterations of the story. I'm thinking about the Krypton television series or the Jeff Johns reintroduction of the classic Brainiac in those post-Infinite Crisis comic book stories, where not only is he miniaturizing and bottling a city from the planets that he visits, but there's some hand in the destruction of the planet. Whereas here in this story, he has seen his world succumb to destruction and is going to these other places that are on the precipice of this, and he's preserving a sample, but not necessarily hastening its destruction.
Right.
Which I thought was just a nice, but just an interesting spin that I felt kind of carved out a little bit of a different lane than we've seen before.
I think sympathetic is a good word. You get some Thanos vibes a little bit when you read this. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll read a story from the point of view of the antagonist just to see. And this one plays very well when you do that. If you read this from Brainiac's point of view, even the fact that he causes his own death, and of course Superman tries to prevent the villain from dying. He did everything he could. But it does come across very sympathetic, because in Brainiac's mind, as with any great villain, he thinks of himself as a hero. And to see how sometimes there's just literally not enough room in this town for the both of them is what played out here.
Yeah, absolutely. So along hand in hand with the introduction of Brainiac to this world is the revelation that Brainiac had bottled the Kryptonian city of Kandor moments before the planet's destruction, including Jor-El and Lara. And we and Superman discover this when Superman sacrifices himself, goes along with Brainiac, because Brainiac has identified Earth and has identified Superman as this contaminant within the planet. And to spare the Earth, Superman, selfless as always, right, is willing to go along with Brainiac and is miniaturized and is placed within the bottle, and then comes face to face with his parents, which inherently there's a lot to mine from that. I won't lie, and I talked about this when we did the episode the first time. I was curious to see if I would feel differently this time. I didn't really. It's not even so much a critique. It's more just, let's say, a disagreement. I don't know that I would have gone so far as to have Jor-El and Lara alive in the bottle. I feel like maybe Zor-El and Allura, you would still have that familial connection. There's a pathway to Supergirl if we ever want to go down that road. I feel like you would tap into a lot of the same dynamics, but you would still preserve that element of loss. I mean, the loss is still there. The planet is gone. And even by the end of the story, the inhabitants and the city of Kandor are still miniaturized. So the loss is still there. But I don't know, it felt like a little bit too much for me. How did you feel though?
So I really loved the amount of time that Cal got to spend with his mother. And I noticed again on reread that it's really his first major interaction. He meets both his parents, but then for page after page after page after that, he's spending quality time with his mother, and they're catching up, and she's really letting him feel all the love that she's missed out on giving him all those years. And she's interested in Lois, and she's interested in Ma and Pa Kent in a way where she's so appreciative that, and I think it's just, it hits that, what to me was a gap in the Superman mythos itself, that Clark had all the crystals with Jor-El, and we saw all the time that he got to spend with Jor-El. And so I appreciated that he got to have this, and that he wasn't asking her questions. She just wanted to get to know her son. I know some people, say, oh, it's messing with the story a little bit too much. And I can completely understand that, because this is a bubble outside of comic continuity. This is within the Donner continuity. And this, if you think of it as its own separate thing, it did have room in it for this to be the path that that the Brainiac intervention could have gone.
No, absolutely. And look, it's not the hill I'm going to die on. It's funny too, because I've never been in the camp that Superman needs to be driven by loss, either the loss of his home planet or his birth parents, or the death of one or both of his Earth parents, for stories that do go down that path. And we've had different incarnations with respect to that. But I've never been in the camp that he needs to be driven by that. But there is still an element of loss that I do find really kind of intrinsic in this story. So that's where I do kind of wrestle with it a little bit. But it definitely leads to some moving scenes between them. And in particular, it created a great opening for Kal-El to speak about his upbringing on Earth, mm-hmm. right? And how much the influence of the Kents had on him, and how unaccustomed he is to Kryptonian ways. I think one of the best bits of the first Superman 78 miniseries is Kal-El struggling to fit in once he's in the bottle city of Kandor. He's a little clumsy with the glass that he's drinking out mm-hmm. of, and he doesn't have the answers to the societal questions and problems that the people are coming to him with. And you just see this kind of culture clash. And I thought that was really fascinating, and just a different dynamic, and something you don't typically see with Superman. So like, I thought, again, there's so much about this I really like. I can get over the Jor-El and Lara, but that's the one piece that kind of, I remain kind of troubled by.
Yeah, I thought that was a great scene too, where you see him just sort of brushing, because he accidentally spilled a little bit of the drink on the front of what clearly are the ceremonial robes, which is actually why I'm wearing this right now. But there was a moment that to me sort of touched my heart, and I just went, oh, in a good way, when Kal first walks out wearing the white with the black emblem, and Laura said, "You look so much like your father at that age." And Kal/Clark said, "No one's ever said that to me before." And that hit me, because yes, he grew up the adopted son of Ma and Pa, but he didn't resemble his pa like everyone else in town resembled their pa. And for him to finally feel that, I thought that was, in one panel, Robert really put so much emotion that's there if you want it. And Robert is a huge fan of the films. I mean, you can tell that he knows the plot points and the histories, and I doubly appreciated that he put that in there, because it was this all kinds of original idea to not have another actor portray Jor-El, but have that be Christopher Reeve playing a dual role. So in a sense, he would have played a triple role in the film. And so the nod back to that of, yes, this is almost what we got, was, again, just, I love this series for all the layers, and that was yet again a layer that's there if you want it.
Yeah, that's a great touch. That's the thing throughout both of these stories, and hopefully more to come. The love and care and affection for the source material is readily apparent in what you see on the page. And every time I've read these stories, I've had the Superman the movie soundtrack playing alongside me. And to be honest, even if I didn't have it playing on my phone, I think I would still be hearing it in my head because that's what the story conjures. But having it alongside, it just kind of takes it to another level. It really makes you feel like you're back in this world. And I've talked about this before. I've always had a little bit of a hesitation when it comes to these kinds of adaptations or continuations in comic book form of film and TV projects. For whatever reason, they've never really appealed to me. I think often because they just feel like they're kind of like the Thing, but they're not the Thing. But this, and I've said this in other episodes, I feel like this one in particular went a long way towards helping me get over that because of how much it felt like that world. And especially in this first miniseries, when you get to that first shirt rip, that silent page with those two big panels, it's amazing. Yeah, you hear it.
Yeah. And that it's so universal. I've never met anyone who's read this that didn't say that.
Yeah, no, it's a huge compliment to or credit to Robert and to Wilfredo for what they were able to bring forth, and obviously that gives rise to the second story. But within this first miniseries, and just kind of thinking about the care for the original series and these little Easter eggs and whatnot, we have a Gus Gorman cameo in one of the panels there. Were there other things like that stood out that you want to mention?
Well, the Goonies. The Goonies were there as a nod to Donner. There were, I'm also an artist, so I loved that Wilfredo decided to take the approach of not only using stills from the I guess all four movies really, as body reference, but also he'd pick up a lot of the background characters. So the reporter and the cameraman who were originally looking up during the helicopter save in Superman 1, like they're drawn in a crowd scene. And then you look right behind them and there's Shaggy from the Scooby-Doo gang. And all of those things are very 70s. The hairstyles are 70s. And so even, I guess what I'm getting at is even the set design and the background characters add to the believability, the verisimilitude of this series. And you do believe that it would and could have been the next one. And then to turn one of your phrases, if we want to talk about the brainiac of it all, the fact that this was a potential Donner next movie and the villain is Brainiac is very our multiverse version of the world that we physically live in. And all this information is out there. Everyone, I encourage you to Google it because it's fascinating. But Brainiac was almost a villain in a live action Superman movie 3 times. It was in the original draft of Superman 3, which was rewritten and ended up being the super scary computer that is the stuff of all of our nightmares, I believe. And then again in Superman Reborn, and again in Superman Lives, though that was the main concept. So to not only get finally a Christopher Reeve movie with Brainiac as the villain, but to have Brainiac not be just some Dalek with 2 legs, this cold, I am a villain, was pretty great. And the fact that Wilfredo used what we all know as the classic Brainiac robot shape that came out in '83, designed by Ed Harrigan, to a T. I mean, it is those robots and that giant skull with the same amount of tentacles. I mean, it is just, that is the Brainiac that is the real Brainiac in every conceivable way. And so it would be as if Tom Mankiewicz and Richard Donner said, we're going to just do our thing again, and we're going to display this as if it were truth.
As you know, Daniel, I grew up in the Triangle era of comics with the Milton Fine incarnation of Brainiac. And even for me, with my deep love for that era of the comics, I still prefer this incarnation of Brainiac and this design. So there's something very, very powerful and very compelling about it. And like we were saying just a few minutes ago, again, it would have been one thing, and I think this would have lost me a little bit if the comic had Superman, I don't know, traveling through all these different dimensions or in situations that realistically would not have been able to be captured on screen at that time.
Mm-hmm.
It just would have felt like something else. But I think what we get here, for the most part, again, like I said, it feels like something that could have been brought to life on screen at this time. And so that really went a long way towards really making me buy into this and make it feel like it was this continuation of the story we had been following. There's one other piece. I don't mean to beat up on this because I said this the last time we talked about it on the show, but Lex's role in this, the idea that Superman would see potential for Lex to be some sort of positive contributor to society and would take a step towards making that a reality, all for. I'm on board with that. That feels very Superman. It just feels like a bridge too far that Lex is out on parole and is out in the world and has an apartment. And I know Superman's keeping tabs on him. It still just feels like a little bit much given what Lex has done. Like if he were confined to, I don't know, some sort of, prison type scenario, even if it were more expansive, I feel like that would have tracked for me a little bit better. It just felt like a little bit of a stretch that he's out roaming the streets after what he's done.
I could understand that. I mean, he did start off the first Donner film with the murder of a police officer. So much less what he did to California and much less working in concert with 3 Kryptonian villains who wreaked no calculable end of havoc. That's quite a hand rinse for him to have been given on Superman's word that I'll look out for him. You're right. I mean, that's a lot.
But the spirit of it tracks. And
yes.
Again, I know you have this connection with Robert. Robert, if you happen to listen to this episode, I really honestly, I love both of these miniseries, and even if I might bump up against a couple of story choices, it doesn't diminish my enjoyment of them. And I mean that sincerely, even if you never listen to this. One of the other things I wanted to ask you, because I know you go to all of these events dressed as Superman and dressed as the Christopher Reeve iteration of the character, and you're at conventions and Superman Celebration and whatnot. Over these past few years, and I know there's the whole social media component, which is not nothing, but I guess particularly when you're at these in-person events over these past few years since these miniseries have been out, I don't know, what's the vibe? Like, what do people say about them? What's the general discourse about them among your fellow Superman the movie Christopher Reeve fans?
So it's interesting. The general vibe when I'm anywhere and I meet anyone is that Christopher Reeve never left the public's consciousness. He was never gone and made a return. He's still Superman. There have been others, but when I wear Reeve's particular design, no one treats it like it's, oh, he's bringing back something from a bygone era. In the same way that I've seen cosplayers who come as George Reeves, they get a different form of appreciation. You know, they're like, oh, I'm so glad you did this. It's great to see this again. That's the phrase that I never hear, that it's great to see this again. Chris never left. However, fans of the Superman 78 comic series can't wait to tell me how much they loved it, and they want to know what I think about it, because they just assume that I'm probably fully versed. And you know, I'm glad that I don't disappoint. I think and I'm smiling. I think there's a great tendency of any fan when they see someone who they think might be willing to sit and talk with them for half an hour about all the little threads that they also love, and then that actually happens. That makes me feel wonderful that I get to be, you know, sort of one half of that great memory that they'll take with them later. And I'll talk about this all day. I mean, you mentioned Lex Luthor, and I think, I hope we get to talk about how it's a classic team up, and it's been in comics all this time, and that was the vibe here. It wasn't just Brainiac, but we got the Brainiac Lex team up, and how, you know, and I immediately start to become that kid.
Well, you know, it's on that note, that is one of the things, especially looking at both of these miniseries together. Lex ends up being Superman's ally in a really critical way in both stories. helping him get out of the bottle and then helping him shut down that metallo armor when we get to the second story. So yeah, it is fascinating. Kind of bridging the two miniseries here. So the first one concluded, and then we got this really gorgeous hardcover collection of the 6 issues, which I assume you're going to grab right next to you. Awesome. And underneath that dust jacket, you have that VHS-esque cover. As an artist yourself and a fan of this world, I just wanted to get your take on the design aspect of that collected edition. Chef's
kiss, brilliant. I saw that and the golf clap began. I could not compliment enough whoever had the original idea and whoever shepherded it all the way through and gave it to us. It's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. And I got to give a shout out to my buddy Sean Hendricks from Fat Moose Comics in Whippany, New Jersey. He sent me a copy of it shortly after it released, and I have it proudly displayed on my shelf, and I cracked it open for this reread. And one of the things I remember when the hardcover came out, in the blurbs about the creators in Robert's section, the last line was that he's currently working on the next volume of the Superman 78 series, which, if I'm not mistaken, that was the first confirmation we had. Maybe you had some inside info, but the audience at large had, I think, that this was continuing, because I remember it being kind of like a big deal that this info was out there.
I don't remember the timing of it. I have kept some of Robert's secrets before, so I might have, but if so, not by much.
But in any event, we get the Metal Curtain, this follow-up miniseries, and I remember when they announced it and we started seeing some art, and then especially those first preview pages, and you see this object crashing into a barn in 1950s Russia. I remember my first instinct was, oh, are we doing a takeoff on Superman Red Sun? That was where my mind went. And while maybe that could have been an interesting story, it wasn't one that I was all that excited about, because I felt like, all right, we've been down that road. And so now obviously reading and immersing myself in the full story and seeing that's not what it was at all, but rather it was kryptonite that landed in Russia and then was used to power this suit that had been built by Lex to create this metallo. I just thought it was such a great spin.
Oh, even from, because the first page is a 2-panel where Krypton, begins to rumble, then explodes. And then you get to, sort of the movie opening credits, and you see the tiny little chunk, go through space. And I think even in the second panel of that, it goes through something swirly. And before it went through the swirly thing, it was a white color. And after it went through the swirly thing, it was a green color, which I thought, what a great callback to one of the versions of how kryptonite comes to be. Because a thing that we always talked about as kids is like, wait a minute, like you don't live on a planet that's poison to you. Like something had, and so that was a great nod to that. And then for the very next panel to be that it zooms by Bizarro's cube world, I just knew right away, this is going to hit some sweet, sweet notes. And then when it went into Russia, I didn't think it was going to redo Red Sun, but I thought, whatever spin this is going to be, I'm in.
Yeah, it really worked. It worked beautifully. And like we were saying at the top, really taps into those Cold War dynamics and in positioning Metallo as this champion of Russia versus this American symbol in the form of Superman, and this ideological clash along with a physical clash in a way that Superman typically doesn't experience, because now he's up against Kryptonite. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations: Harrison, New York, aka my local comic shop, Skokie, Illinois, or Muncie, Indiana. If you have kids and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw Yeah. This episode made possible in part by educator, hobby comic book collector, and pop culture enthusiast Sam Lim. Sam is based in the South Jersey area and is looking to connect with other comics fans as well as retailers. They're also looking for comic shops to explore, so recommendations are welcome. Be sure to follow Sam on Instagram at SZL Comics to see their latest comic pickups and shop adventures. Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and under new ownership since 2020, Moose sells a wide selection of comics from every publisher and time period, along with action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. Following that initial crash landing in Russia on a farm, right? So of course we have those echoes of the story that we know. We have Lois, right, investigating this deal between the U.S. military and the shadowy figure, who of course we'll later learn is Lex, right, selling this armor that he's created to who he thinks is someone from the United States military, but is actually this Russian operative who's been posing right here on U.S. soil. And essentially the gist of it is that the Russians have had kryptonite. They've had this unimaginable power source, but not a way to harness it. And Lex, on the other hand, has built this war machine that lacks sufficient fuel because the only kryptonite that he had, as he says later in the story, he had placed around Superman's neck, and Superman wasn't kind enough to return it. So, he sells this to who he thinks is the U.S. military, but of course it ends up going to Russia, and they place their soldier in it. And then we have, really, I would say, I guess, a trio of clashes between Metallo and Superman over the course of the story here. The first one happens when Superman is with Lois in the fortress, introducing her to his parents, still in the Bottle City. And you've talked about the layers to this story. Some interesting parallels here because, again, early on we have Superman introducing Lois to his birth parents. Not long after that, we'll have Superman meeting General Lane, Lois's father. Right? So you get these interesting parallels. But Superman taking Lois to the fortress and this bit about him getting ready to reveal his identity to her again, though it will be the first time for her because she doesn't remember the events of Superman 2. Yeah, what was your take on that?
I thought it was like every story needs those moments of sweetness and of this is why we're fighting, because we want people to be able to love and have these moments. This is what we're protecting. It's like some of the stories that you hear from the veterans of World War II that like they kept reminding themselves, when we get home, we're going home to our girl and we're going to have this life together and we're going to have children. And I think it's one thing to have an action adventure story and it's all well and good. And there are some absolutely fantastic ones that are nothing but that. But I always appreciate these moments when you get to see this is why Superman does what he does, that he's no different. He, after a battle, wants to come home to his best girl. I mean, she's the Peggy Carter to Steve Rogers. And to have him be so awkward about introducing his best girl to his parents because nothing means more to him than that this work. And then to have Laura say, he's just as awkward as you were, Jor-El. And Jor-El do that dad thing of almost like, I was hoping it would skip a generation, and then she reassures her husband, we got on all right. And those vignette moments that Robert's so great at having them not take up too much time, but it does ground you again that when he has to leave to go save somebody, he is leaving something that he cares about. So he's always making this moral math, these equations of what's more important right now. And I think to see that even in those little moments of it's almost like a guy who's about to propose to his girlfriend and something comes up, he's like, all right, well, I'll come back to this, I hope. And that Lois got to just continue to talk to Jor-El and Lara, even when Superman was off saving, Hal Jordan, that they continued to have this, this nice talk over dinner would have been the equivalent in normal reality, was pretty great. And I'm glad that those things are in there because it also informs the character of Lois. It lets her know, oh, this is where the man I love comes from. And I'm positive she set her notebook down and just started to get to know Superman's mom. And even though that's off panel and I'm completely inventing it in my head, isn't that the point of a good story?
Yeah, and jumping ahead, but continuing on that Lois and Jor-El and Lara thread, later in the story when Superman is going off to Russia for what could be his final battle, he says to Lois, he entrusts Lois with the care of Kandor. He's like, I don't know how, but I know that you'll know the right thing to do. So to see the faith that he has in her is great. I don't mean to be a jerk. The thing that I that I had a little bit of an issue with was especially this idea of Superman being ready to reveal himself. Right? They're in the fortress. He changes into his Clark Kent guise, and he comes out and he's like, Lois, and clearly he's not using his Clark Kent voice because she's like, yes, Superman. But before she can turn around and see Clark, he goes off to save, as you said, the pilot, who very clearly is Hal Jordan, who goes by the code name Highball. And is his pilot and looks just like him. And we'll get back to that Metallo skirmish. But I don't know, my read on Superman 2, regardless of which cut we're talking about, but we'll go with the theatrical cut, is that they can't be together, and Superman has accepted that. So, although on the other hand, it's like, well, it's probably realistic and human and relatable that he would entertain this notion again. Or maybe I just have a different read on the movie. But I guess my takeaway was always that that book was kind of closed at that point. I don't know. How have you viewed it?
I think, and I've asked myself this too, I think two major things changed. One was the premise of any hero protecting his girl from his identity is to protect them from the danger. And yet in the first, Superman 78 comic series, Brainiac still came. Metropolis was still floating in the air, about to be either miniaturized or drop where everyone would be instantly killed. So I think possibly he realized Lois is never going to be safe. And if she had been able to call me, almost the Jimmy Olsen signal watch thing of Superman is able to look out for Jimmy because they have that ability. And that might have been part of it, is this idea that I'm not guaranteeing her safety by protecting her from my identity. So as the son of a scientist, maybe that just began to take hold as a physical truth, right? And then secondly, I think just getting his mother and father back and having these talks with his mother and seeing how much that should be part of someone's life. Maybe he gave it another thought and realized if anyone is capable to stand on her own and not only deal with the truth, but function and have it not be something that is a weight that he's put on her, but rather a burden that's been lifted because now she can express everything. And he doesn't have to constantly make her feel like she's reading situations wrong. I think he just, after he got his mother back, I think they probably had some heart-to-hearts and he went off and thought about it.
I like that. I like your read on it. And I definitely agree that there's some room for interpretation here. And to the story's credit, it's not as if we plunge into a potential romance again in the first miniseries. It is in the second one where we get closer to that. And yeah, when you factor in what they've experienced in that Brainiac storyline and everything else you laid out, there's something to that. One of the things that's interesting, I'm sure this was a very conscious choice, is that there's no inner monologue of Superman that we are privy to, which is something that's a very commonly used storytelling device in comics. And that's not employed here. And there's a part of me that says, oh, I would love to get more insight into what's in his head. But I don't think that would have served these stories well, especially because they're meant to be in keeping with these films where you don't have that. You have the expressions and you have what they say and you have what they do. You don't have that inner monologue. So even though there's a little part of me that kind of craved that insight into what he's thinking, I ultimately appreciate the restraint, because I think that's, and I don't want to say it's a crutch. I think in a lot of stories, it serves a very important function and I like it, but I think here it probably would have been. So I'm glad that that was not used here.
I am too. And I think that's something that for any readers who may not have dived into these stories yet, it is a cinematic experience. It's intentionally written and drawn. Wilfredo did an amazing job for it to feel like a cinematic experience. There are plenty of full width, screen dimension panels that show an event happening over time, when Metropolis was being lifted up, and then when Superman came back and he's trying to catch it in mid-fall. There's a good 3 or 4 pages of just it's falling. He's struggling. You see people panicking. You see his eyes and the tears coming out because he does not know if he can do this. And then you see from a distance it falling like Sokovia, and you just turn the pages and it feels like you're sitting in a theater, and the passage of that 20 seconds of the movie is what it is. No one is narrating it. No one, like, if there's music, that's it. And it adds to the tension. It adds to the excitement. It adds to the what is going to happen next. And even in some of these personal interactions, like, Clark about to tell Lois that he's Clark. The fact that we're experiencing it from outside of his thoughts in the same way Lois would, I think adds to in this particular moment, we're in Lois's POV. And that's what I think this technique lets you do, is it lets you move from character to character and experience it like they would, not being a telepath.
Right. No, I do agree. So that leads us to this first altercation with Metallo, where Superman saves Highball, again, though not named. Hal Jordan very clearly seems to be intended to be that character. And the two of them clash, and Superman does not make out well. He is pretty handily bested by Metallo. This is like Rocky fighting Clubber Lang for the first time in Rocky 3, or Drago versus Apollo Creed in Rocky 4. I mean, this is a very one-sided battle where he really gets the drop on Superman. And that second issue ends with Superman just in the water, unconscious. And thankfully, Highball and the rest of the military come to his aid, and he wakes up, and that's when he has that meeting with Sam. But one of the things that I liked in the rest of the story is that the physical, but also the psychological ramifications of that battle really continue to play out, where Superman is still suffering the effects of the kryptonite exposure, but also continuing to have these flashes of this battle. And I liked it. I mean, I think, again, just like, I feel like it's a different flavor of what we got in that first story, where he's uncomfortable in the Bottle City and he's not used to their customs and he's, kind of off. Here too, you see him struggling in a way that you typically don't. So that degree of fallibility, I just found really intriguing. I like that dynamic to this story, and it felt very believable.
It really did. And the thing that I so appreciated about the first Metallo battle is that Superman began from a point of, wait, let's talk. Let me try to understand you. Why are you here? What do you want? This doesn't have to be what you think it has to be, possibly. And so that's really the advantage that any Ivan Drago type character has, is if they come out to kill from the first bell and the other person is still interested and perhaps we can come to an understanding, then that first fight is very much advantage Drago. Just by the sheer, purpose, that the single-mindedness that they have of what this is and how it's going to go down. But I appreciate that in our hero. I like that that's what he did as his first move. That was his counter, is wait, let's talk. Let's see if I can understand you. And that's what I want in my hero.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And we've made this Drago comparison a few times, and I think it's certainly apt. And again, the use of Metallo here, just like the use of Brainiac in the first story, I think was spot on. Similarly here, I think Metallo is a great choice for all the reasons that we've cited, and it just ties into this ideological battle between these two superpowers here. But again, the character generally is one that I feel is ripe for greater exploration and clearly can be used in different ways here. So anytime that we can, I think, kind of mix it up a little bit and pull in from different corners of the rogues gallery, I'm all for it. And here's the thing. This was not a one-note character. I think this was a really important piece in this story. And it would have been very easy to make him that, to make him more like Ivan Drago in Rocky IV. But here I feel like they made him more like Ivan Drago in Creed II, where he has this arc and there's more to him. And, not to short circuit the conversation or jump ahead too much, but, essentially this idea that he butts up against his commander's strategy, right? It's all about, engaging in these battles in public view, and he's willing to sacrifice the other soldiers to make Superman and the United States look worse. Whereas for our Metallo here, it's really just about getting this particular job done for his people. And, we'll get to the climax of the story where his eyes are open really to the lies and the indoctrination that he's been subjected to. But I just love that aspect. And again, I have to keep going back to Rocky, but it really did make me feel like the iteration of Drago we got in Creed II, where you really got to see the humanity to him. And he had an arc, I would argue.
Totally agree. And that's another part of the fact that the underpinnings of this story is ideological, gives rise to that kind of contrast, that Xavier, Magneto contrast. One of the things that I really loved about this is that this Metallo is being used as a weapon. He's being built, he's being manufactured, and he's being pointed and told at whom to shoot. A drastic difference to his counterpart in America, Superman, who is wanting more inclusion and more understanding and more unity. And there's a specific panel in the story where Superman says there is no us, there is no them. We're all just people. We all want the same things. We all deserve the same things. And America aside, that's the core values that Clark Kent has inside of the cape and inside of the House of El robes. It's still, this is what Ma and Pa taught him. And when the cliche description of Superman is that, well, he has those small town values, but that's one of them. That everyone looks out for each other. No one is more special in a time of need. And that is shown with the rescue of the little girl at the Kremlin and in these other things where people realize he's not putting this on. There's no propaganda going on. There are no cameras. He just was there in a time of need because to him, no one is more special than anyone else in a time of need. And so the fact that that was the truth that they witnessed for themselves takes the legs out of the propaganda. And that was, I think, one of the victories. There's more than one at the end of the story. So, but that's one of them that I thought was very, very satisfying to me of what a point to make. It's about action.
1,000%. And when he's talking about how we're all just people, it felt like an echo of the speech that he gives at the end of Superman 4, Quest for Peace, about, I wish you could see this world the way I do, right?
Yes.
And that we're all one world, one people. So I love that. Let me just throw this in now where we're talking about echoes so I don't forget, but there is a sequence when Metallo, out of the armor, but clearly his body has changed due to this exposure to the kryptonite, and he's stronger, and he's punching the wall, right? Mm-hmm. Panel after panel, the fist into the wall. Shades of Doomsday, right? And the build up to Doomsday's release from that containment in those early 90s issues. So I love that. I have to imagine that was intentional.
And also let me throw some Karate Kid in here too, because the Johnny Lawrence character, the sensei who led him astray, who he bought into, and the frustration that even in the original films, and I'm a big fan of the Cobra Kai series. I think they did a fantastic job, and I love Johnny's arc in the Cobra Kai series. But even in the original film, you sense a frustration in Johnny because his surrogate father is not giving him what he needs. And again, he's just using Johnny. He's weaponizing Johnny, and the sweep the leg command that was, not something that Johnny was hoping that his surrogate father would want him to do, that breaks down their relationship. I felt a lot of that in the relationship between Metallo and his Russian commander of, you've been saying to me this set of words, but the way that you're behaving emblemizes this other way of thinking. And I'm starting to feel the fool. And punching the wall was, to me, like the teenage Johnny Lawrence angst of, I don't know what's happening here, but I'm starting to feel the fool.
That's a great parallel. And I too love Cobra Kai. It's absolutely amazing. And I agree. Johnny Lawrence's journey has really been something. And so Metallo punching the wall in frustration, that follows the second altercation in this story where Metallo invades Washington, D.C. And Superman, though he's been defeated before and really isn't sure that this will go any differently, of course, still enters into battle. But he gets a last-minute save from Lex, who reaches out to him via this frequency that only Superman can hear and explains that there is a failsafe behind the neck that Superman is able to press that starts to shut down the armor. Before it fully shuts down, Metallo takes off. And we do have the United States military barking orders at Superman, like, hey, go after him. And Superman says, you might have the line top of mind, but something along the lines of, there's been enough fighting today.
Mm-hmm.
How much of that do you think was he's depleted after the kryptonite exposure and the battle, and maybe he can't really go after him, versus, no, he truly thinks there's been enough fighting today and maybe we'll be able to find a better path in the future and avoid further physical altercation?
I took it as equal parts of both. That in every incarnation of the Christopher Reeve Superman, his first instinct is, gentlemen, is that man all right?
Right.
Do you need help? So I think he wanted to make sure that everyone that was just right there is okay, and that he wouldn't do something that would bring the battle right back. Every incarnation of the Christopher Reeve movie has always accidentally brought a battle to Metropolis also. So I think this is one where equal parts. He knew he might not win, but it's not the move to bring it back.
And then Superman arranges this meeting out in the desert with Lex and Sam Lane and Lois Lane, and everyone gets brought up to speed. And Superman decides to go to Russia to take on Metallo, because otherwise they'll continue to attack. They'll continue to invade. And there's this idea, this line that's introduced here in this scene about the fact that he doesn't know that he can win, but he doesn't need to know, right? I just have to believe. I want to toss it to you because I know this line, and more particularly the payoff that we get later. I know this is meaningful to you, so I want to let you run with it.
Yeah. So a little backstory. This is one of the things that Robert and I got so excited about talking when I had a chance to talk to him about it. And at that point, it was a mystery what the payoff line was going to be. But as Robert was writing the story, he had that great experience of being a writer where you've mapped out where it's all going to go. But sometimes stories take on a life of their own. Sometimes something springs up and surprises the author himself. And this was definitely one of those times where he knew the point that he wanted to make, which is, this is not a Batman character or a Midnighter character who goes into every battle so prepared, having every angle covered, that it's really then just a matter of executing it. This is a character who really just believes that the world should be a place where people who want to do the right thing have the space to do the right thing. that they can be safe and they can have the room to grow and that they can get together and collectively do the right thing. I mean, he's more of a positive enabler of if I can stop the asteroid, if I can stop the volcano, if I can do all these things, I have no interest whatsoever in being your overlord. I want you to be able to have the room to grow. And when you think about it, isn't that what the son of a farmer would think? And so when these kind of moments happen where he has to go into a battle, no, he does not have the full intel or know what his strategy might be, but there's no one else that can go. First and foremost, if something happened back on the farm and Clark was little, Pa he'd be the first one out the door, and sometimes I think you just feel that sense of when you love something, when you love your family, when you love your community, when you love your home, and something happens, you are the one who goes out the door. And so I think a lot of that is that. And some of it is just, he really is hope personified. I think he believes when I get there, I'll learn something. When I get there, something will make itself an opportunity, but I won't know until I'm there. So the way to win is to take that step, put myself there, and then look and see what could there be that is the way out of this. And one of the things that Robert told me about how many writers shy away from wanting to write Superman because of his reputation of always being cliche, dragged. He's overpowered. He's boring. There's nothing new to say about him. And in Robert's view, that the trick to writing Superman is, yes, he is a Boy Scout. Yes, he is these other things. And it's not will he or won't he win a battle. And it's not even how will he win a battle. It's putting him in a situation where not even he himself knows, how do I get out of it and stay me? It's not that I can't get out of it. I could go Homelander and get out of it. But how do I do it and still have lived up to what I need to wake up to in the mirror tomorrow? It's not even a matter of have I followed through on what I've told people. It's his own internal morality of, sure, I could murder, or sure, I could destroy, or I could take this guy. I could throw anyone into the sun that I didn't like, but that's not, and so I think that's why sometimes he'll take some punches and he'll try to understand the other side, and he'll go that approach. He'll take a hit if it means that he's had the ability to get a bigger picture and maybe find a way out of this, not just for himself, but for everyone, where everyone can face tomorrow feeling like we're still those people that can be better. We didn't succumb to something so dark that there was no coming back from that. And so when he says to Lois, I just have to believe, that's what I took from it is I could go win, but I have to believe that we could all look at these events, whatever they turn out to be. I'm about to fly into the Kremlin, and there's going to be, as there always is, the next day. What do people think of that I flew into the Kremlin? How did I handle that? I care just as much about that. And he won't know until he gets there, but he's the one who has to go.
Beautifully said. And that's the thing, that it's not, and we get this articulated later in the story, it's not the belief in himself, right? But this belief in others. Because he makes this plea, this offer to Metallo when they're fighting or about to fight, that let this end with me, with Superman. Mm-hmm. Like, let this end with me. You can defeat me. There doesn't need to be further bloodshed. And of course, Metallo's pushing back, and Superman says again, I just have to believe. And Metallo's like, what makes you believe you'll make it out of this alive? And that's when Superman says, it's not that I believe in myself. And then we get this splash page, this gorgeous splash page of Superman saying, I believe in you.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout this battle, and we were hitting on this before, and yes, the tagline to this podcast, it's about what you do, it's about action, was definitely ringing in my ears as I was watching the battle unfold, because throughout, you see Metallo attacking pretty indiscriminately, and you see all these bystanders in trouble. And that's where Superman directs his efforts. He saves all of these people from a pillar that's going to collapse, from a building that's shattering. I can't help but wonder, this might be a little bit of a response to the Man of Steel movie, but that's its own thing. But the fact that he is so concerned with helping all of these innocent civilians who at the start of this are afraid of him, are afraid of Superman, because that's what they've been taught to do. That's what they've been taught about this American symbol. And through his actions, right, through his care for other people, he's able to turn the tide of their public opinion, not unlike in Rocky IV, when you get to the end of that fight and that Russian crowd is cheering for Rocky Balboa, to the point where, as Metallo's about to deliver another blow, that little girl who Superman had saved earlier reaches up, puts her hand and stops him. And to Metallo's credit, now he's able to start to see, right, what he's been blinded to all along, and ultimately makes the ultimate sacrifice where he detonates, flies up into the sky and detonates the armor so that it can't be used by anyone else. But yeah, that belief that Superman has in other people and that care for other people, that's ultimately what turns the tide. It's not about the power that he has in that moment. And just this whole idea of belief, there's a line, I've quoted this so many times in various episodes, but it's from Jeff Loeb, Tim Sale's story that was set within the time frame of For All Seasons, but it's the prom night story that's narrated by Martha.
Yes.
Where Clark is on his way to take Lana to the prom, and he helps this nasty old lady whose car was broken down on the side of the road, and he helps her, and then she speeds off and splatters him with mud. But Martha, in her narration, says, Clark does for other people what he does because he believes that's what other people would do themselves. Right. And so he helps to this degree that he can, because that's what's within his ability, but he believes others would as well. And so to see him put that belief into action, I love the way this whole battle and this whole climax unfolded. I thought it was very, very effective.
It was heroic in the way that means the most to me about what is a hero. It was just so perfect. It's one of the best endings to a Superman story that I think I've read, and that's saying a lot.
Yeah, and I'll say that the whole Superman as the American symbol piece, it's not like he's spouting American propaganda, but he is seen as this symbol of it, and particularly given the time frame that we're talking about of the 70s into the 80s here. And even just looking at the end of Superman 2, where he brings the flag back to the White House and he has this moment with the president. I'm sorry, I've been away so long. It won't happen again. So it's like, he is that symbol. And so to pit the two of them against each other, again, in this general time frame, it all tracks. I was, again, I wasn't reading this as it was coming out. I was waiting for it to complete, and I knew we would do this episode. So, really, it's just been over these past few days. I read it twice, and I really had a great time with it. To be honest, I think I enjoyed the Metal Curtain even more than the first one, if I'm being perfectly honest. There's something like all these themes that we're talking about, I just really found very compelling. I think I enjoyed the second one more than the first.
Yeah, I think I did too. Which again is quite a statement, because the first was outstanding, but the heart that this had, and the final message that stuck the landing, it was just so intentional and so pitch perfect. It did not come across too heavy-handed. And then the fact that it went back to everyone's regular life, and that's really what we all hoped to have for ourselves, and when he continued to hold as his one mission uh, is pretty great. And I do know that Robert's got 3 more ideas in his back pocket. So if these continue to come out, there will be, I think, some more growth in this same direction.
That would be great. I look forward to that. I mean, hopefully this has done well critically and commercially to the point where DC would welcome another installment of this. As an audience member, as a reader, I certainly would. Oh, I'd be remiss if I didn't cite my favorite line from this, other than "I believe in you." But there's that great bit during that scene in the desert when Lex is talking about how he was duped, right? He thought he was selling the machine he created to the United States military. He would never sell to the Russians. He goes, "I'm a capitalist."
Yeah.
Which I just, it was great. And that felt very, very in keeping for Lex. I got a kick out of that.
It is great how Superman's ally isn't Lex Luthor. It's Lex Luthor's ego.
Yes.
I'm not going to let Brainiac be the one who takes Superman down. That's my destiny. And so he'll step in because that glory already has Lex's name at the bottom of the trophy. He just has to win it. But in his mind, there is no other outcome other than eventually I, Lex Luthor, the greatest criminal flame of our age, will checkmate Superman through my own brilliance. And for someone to come in and start, messing with the pieces on his board, his ego will not allow it. So the one thing Superman can depend on, and now twice, is the ego of Lex Luthor.
Yeah. Well, even as he says about the Metallo armor, he's like, "It'll be my armor, but I won't be in it. I don't know which way to root until it's over," or something to that effect. Yeah. No, it's great.
Right.
Honestly, I had such a great time revisiting the first miniseries, reading the second one. I am very hopeful for future installments. I hope we get that. I really enjoyed comparing notes with you, getting your take. I know how much all of this means to you. This incarnation of the character, the movie series, these stories, this relationship that you've been able to forge with the writer of these comic book miniseries. So, you were the perfect person to have here for this. Is there anything else we didn't talk about with respect to these that you wanted to before we go?
I just want to again give a shout out to the artists. One of the things that Robert really, really gives credit on is the component of the acting. As since these are a cinematic experience, as the screenwriter of these new movies, Robert can paint the picture on his typewriter, but it takes the visuals. And you look at the body language of Perry telling Jimmy, "Go take a picture of something." And it is Jackie Cooper talking to Mark McClure, with Mark having the slumped shoulders and Jackie with just the filling the room. All of that captured in the motion of a still panel. And you forget that it's a still panel. It's moving to you. And Wilfredo absolutely grand slammed that effect of as you turn the pages, it almost looked like a webcomic. You're like, is that an optical illusion, or did Perry White just sort of chomp on his cigar for a second in that panel? And Gavin Guidry came on in series 2 and took the torch and said, this is the spirit of what we're doing. And again, you had those moments where during a fight scene, or even the first time we see Highball in his jet, you felt it moving. And so we would be completely remiss not just giving an ovation to the way that was portrayed. And I hope that people notice the colors of Jordie Bellaire, not only in that first series, really set the hopeful, bright Richard Donner tone, but all throughout. I mean, some panels have a majority of red color, and some panels you really feel the kryptonite glow, even just during a conversation. But it had the cinematography of what I would have thought a Donner film would have had, almost to the point where, like, in the next story, I want wheat fields. I want, flying scenes through the blue clouds, which, it's one of those things like the soundtrack, the lighting, and in this case, Troy Belair just absolutely was perfectly cast to be that silent character of the storytelling. In as much as any of the the Tim Sale stories are, you really, really, really notice the color.
I agree wholeheartedly, and it's great to get your take on that specifically as an artist. And yeah, I mean, both of these guys, their work was tremendous. A special shout out to Gavin Guidry, because when it was announced that Wilfredo was not going to be doing the second volume, my reaction, and I imagine others felt this way as well, was like, uh-oh, because he had done such a great job of capturing the likenesses and making you feel like you were in that world. And if you didn't have another artist who could step up to the plate and do the same, this could have all fallen apart. But that's not what happened. And I think Gavin did a great job stepping in. So shout out to the entire art team on both of these series. This was a lot of fun. I encourage everyone to follow at Wearing the Cape on social media, Instagram in particular. Anywhere you want to direct folks beyond that?
Definitely Instagram at Wearing the Cape is where I'll promote not just my appearances, but any articles that I may have recently written for the Daily Planet, appearances like this, just, another picture of crypto from here around the house. It's hopefully just a very pure, family-friendly, fun place where you can go and get a smile and believe in tomorrow.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Daniel. It's always a pleasure. I look forward to the next time that you and I can podcast together. And folks, we're not done yet. The second half of our double feature will continue right after this. This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. Many of you have already used this code, and I greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey, it's Bill Bodkin, editor-in-chief of thepopbreak.com. Join myself, Amanda Rivas, Al Manarino, and a cavalcade of awesome guests on the Socially Distanced Podcast, the flagship podcast of thepopbreak.com.
And it's Amanda Rivas. If you're a pop culture obsessed nerd like we are, then you need to make Socially Distanced an integral part of your life. We talk all the things, Marvel, Star Wars, everything on Disney Plus pretty much, as well as the hottest trending shows and news in the world of pop culture.
This is definitely Al Manarino and not Bill Bodkin. So listen to the Socially Distanced Podcast every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all your favorite podcast platforms. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe so we can eventually get Disney Plus to give us advertising money. Please, we could use the money. I have children.
Acme Comics is a locally owned and operated comic book store in Greensboro, North Carolina, for people of all ages and walks of life. With more than 40 years and a new second location to its name, Acme is a multiple-time Eisner Award nominee. The shop features a significant contemporary and vintage selection, as the Acme team uses their collective knowledge and resources to connect you with the best material. Mail order subscriptions to new releases are available, and all offerings are available anywhere via mail order. Follow Acme on social media and eBay, listen to the Acme Cast on all podcast services, and visit acmecomics.com for much more. And now, the second half of our double feature. Joining me to discuss Mark Millar's run on Superman Adventures is one of the hosts of the All-Star Superfan podcast, returning guest Rob O'Connor. Welcome back.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
This one's been on the list for a little while. When we talk about Superman Adventures, we are referring to the comic book series that ran for 66 issues from 96 through 2002, set in the style and continuity of Superman the Animated Series. And until now, this had been one of those gaps in my fandom, not just the Mark Millar run that we're focusing on, but the series as a whole. So what has your experience been with the series and specifically these Mark Millar written issues?
Okay, so the series as a whole, I'll admit, I mean, I was the prime target demographic when they were coming out. I was probably 6, 7, and 8 when these were coming out, so I was the perfect age for them. But I feel like even as a kid, I had this bias towards these tie-in animated comics because the animated series was this familiar thing that I knew it was on TV, and when I went to a comic shop, which was this bold new thing that I was only discovering, I was like, well, I don't want the version that I already know. I want the comic book. I want the unique, the mainstream DC comic. I don't want the tie-in product, if that makes sense. So I feel like even as a child, I wasn't really that into this series. Now I know my brother actually had one of the issues we're going to talk about, so I did read that, but that was the only issue I read for years. And then I think when I was on these forums, in the mid 2000s, and people were always talking about the Mark Millar run of Superman Adventures and how good it was. So I actually went back and rediscovered those particular issues at that point. And then I think I was enjoying those so much, I ended up reading the whole series. And there's other great writers that write for this series as well. But those Mark Millar issues, man, they're just even back then, they really struck me how instantly good they are and how easy they are to just pick up and read straight away. So that's it in a nutshell, and I've been recommending them to people ever since. Like they're just really, really solid Superman comics.
Yeah, and when I say they've been on the list for a while, I've had numerous friends and audience members recommend them for years now. I feel like maybe we're kindred spirits in a sense, because I also avoided these, and I've talked about this on the show before. I've always had a bit of an aversion to comic book adaptations, tie-ins, or sequels to film and TV projects, even though those projects themselves are adaptations of the comics for whatever reason.
Yes.
I've always had this aversion, and I've talked about it. It's why I dragged my feet for years on Smallville season 11, which I know shocked many people because I love it to death, but it took me forever to get around to the comic. I think one of the things that turned me around a little bit was the Superman 78 miniseries, the first one, because that was an instance where I read it, and though I didn't agree with every single story choice, overall I enjoyed it, and I was like, wow, this really captures the feel of the movies, and I could understand why this would resonate with people and why it would be fun. So I feel like my position has softened a bit, but that's why, or at least one of the reasons why I probably didn't read this the first time around. The other reason, to be perfectly honest, in recent years I've become more educated on the difference between a true kids comic that's aimed squarely at kids versus an all ages book, which can be enjoyed by everyone. And I would say this falls into the latter category, but I think my view on it for a long time was just sort of like, oh, that's for kids.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably another reason why, because look, as I've talked about, I mean, I was reading all the Superman books at this point in time. I was watching Superman, the animated series, so I would seem to be a prime candidate for this, but I never read it. And then again, this has been recommended for a while, specifically the Mark Millar issues. And this is a pre-fame Mark Millar. This is Mark Millar early in his career. This is before Superman Red Son, before Ultimates, before Kick-Ass and Wanted, and all of the very adult-oriented material that he would go to do.
I'm biting my lip here because I don't want to get on my soapbox just yet, but it's also pre-Unfunnies Mark Millar, which is another comic he wrote. We can talk more about that.
Sure. But that's I think it stands out to people, A, because you're catching a creator on the precipice of what would come. And also the fact that this was such an all ages book, particularly compared to the work that he would go on to do. So it really stands out in that respect as well. So this was the first time that I read his issues. I didn't read the whole series, but I read the 20 odd issues that he wrote. And here's the thing. I feel like this is probably an instance of expectations being set a little bit too high, because I enjoyed these. For anyone who's already getting upset, I enjoyed them. I thought they were very enjoyable. There were a few that I thought were especially interesting or clever. It definitely felt to me in keeping with the animated series. There were a few that I said to myself, man, I really wish these had been done as episodes. So there were a few that really, really stood out. Overall, very enjoyable, captured the spirit of the character and the show. But yes, overall, I think I kind of came away feeling a little bit underwhelmed just based on how much I had heard this built up over the years.
Okay. I mean, I want to counter a couple of things you said there. First of all, I should probably make it clear as well. While I did grow up with the animated series, I did watch it while it was on. I watched it every week. I was very excited about it. I had all the toys. I sometimes think it's overstated how special a series it actually was, especially compared to Batman and then the later Justice League stuff. For me, Superman the Animated Series always feels a little bit like a missed opportunity. Like they didn't quite nail the kind of the humor and the whimsy and the fantasy element of Superman because they were so keen on making it a serious show for cool kids and 90s kids who didn't like that cheesy stuff in the older Superman stuff. And there's that moment in the Bizarro episode where they characterize Bizarro at the start of the episode by making him kind of more like the Christopher Reeve Superman, and he's sort of lecturing these kids, not to be doing dares and all this stuff. And then it's almost like the showrunner saying, this is clearly not our Superman because he'd never be such a dork, And there's loads of moments like that where I just feel like it was a very dry show, like even compared to Batman, which had loads of humor in it. And as much as I appreciate the sort of triangle era thing of Superman being depowered, I think he was kind of ridiculously depowered on that show sometimes, to the point where, people with a high caliber machine gun were able to just, and it felt like, anyway, sorry. So suffice to say, this tie-in comic to me kind of reaches my sensibilities a little bit better than the show did in a lot of ways. I think there's a lot of charm in it. There's a lot of laugh out loud moments in it in a really good way. And I think he captures the voices of especially Clark and Superman a little bit closer to what I would have liked from that cartoon. And that's, to your other point, I do think maybe people do build this up. What I think I like about it so much, though, is it's sort of written in the style of a modern comic, but these are nearly all of them are standalone issues. And that was something that was kind of hard to come by in that era, in the 90s. Like if you went to a comic book shop and you picked up a Superman comic, 9 times out of 10, it was, right in the middle of this branching story arc. So it was hard to just kind of, get your money's worth out of that one comic. They wanted you to come back week after week after week. So I think the fact that there are so many of these sort of high quality standalone stories with Superman in them, I think that's another reason why I think I enjoy them so much. And the same can be said of the Batman Adventures, which is also a great comic, which I also didn't give enough love to that as it was coming out, So, but I totally get what you're saying. I think, there probably is too much said about this. And I feel like if it wasn't Mark Millar, would we pay as much attention to it? Who knows?
That's a good question. No, I appreciate getting your insight. And here's the thing. When you were talking about your feelings towards the animated series, I do get that. I do get what you're saying. Yeah. And I think historically, I've probably been in alignment with that to a degree. I think my revisitation of the animated series a few years ago on the podcast when we did our mixtape style approach, I know that was the most I ever enjoyed the show, watching them in blocks like that, blocks of related episodes. And I got so much more out of it. But I don't share the opinion that you just expressed now. I think I have in the past, and I get where you're coming from on it. So that definitely makes sense.
Michael Bailey made a really good point. I think it was on Zach's show, Always Hold On to Smallville. He made a good point that, Batman was this show that was aired on prime time, I think at one stage it was on Fox Kids. It was on a different network. They had a different remit, and they were trying to tell these really character-driven stories. And Superman the Animated Series was on the Kids WB. It was a Saturday morning show. They were really just going for action, and they were going for high action, high adventure, and they were trying to sell toys. And it's harder to sell toys with Superman as well. So they had to make certain compromises, which we'll definitely talk about with this comic as well. So it just had a different agenda. And also there was a million other Superman cartoons, and they were trying not to be just like them. I totally get it. There's just a lot in it that I feel like, a classic example, Perry White is barely in that show at all. He's in these comics more than he's in the entire series of that show. What's that about? Just little things like that. It doesn't, people always talk about it. I think you've called it the gold standard of Superman. For me, it's not quite the gold standard. It's definitely one of the best Superman cartoons. And it's one of the most consistently good Superman television programs ever. But as far as the world building and the characters in it, other than maybe Lex Luthor and Metallo, everybody else in it falls just a little bit short for me. But anyway, I don't want to shit on the show. It's a great series. But that's kind of where I'm at with it.
No, fair enough. And it's great getting that perspective, because I'm sure that informs the way you take in these comics. So it's all good. And I agree with you about the value in having these standalone comic book stories. I love the Triangle era to death, but yes, that's not a period of Superman comics where you could just kind of jump in and grab a random issue. There are a few that kind of work on their own, but for the most part, you were in this weekly adventure, which had its benefits, as we've talked about. But there is something very appealing about this. Out of the 20-something issues that we looked at, there were only two-parters. All the rest were standalones. And not only that, when we get to issue 41, Millar's second to last issue that he wrote, 22 single-page stories.
Love it.
That was such a standout, that one. So kind of on that note, let me ask you, because I want to toss the ball to you and we can proceed however you like. I mean, what were, either in terms of just the themes or characterization or characters used or individual issues, what stood out to you the most about this? Where would you like to start?
Okay, so things that stand out to me the most are, I think the tone and the feel of the series are a big thing for me. I think this, I mentioned it already, it really just captures the tone of what I would want from both a modern version of Superman and just Superman in general. It's very, it's very stylish and it's very fast paced, but it also just has a great sense of humor. And I think, a lot of the times people talk about humor being something that ruins Superman stories. I think bad humor can ruin Superman stories. And I think good humor is necessary in Superman in a way that it isn't in Batman. I think you need humor and a sense of fun in a Superman story. The other thing that I think really stands out to me is some of the characterizations are just spot on. And I think especially Lex Luthor in these comics is just that. I think some of the best Lex Luthor comics ever are in this series. Just as character studies, maybe not as stories themselves, just character studies and moments. There's some incredible Lex Luthor moments. And then I think finally what I'd say is there's a lot of great fan service in this. There's a lot of great callbacks. I don't know if you noticed this, but like clearly Mark Millar likes the Donner movies because there's a litany of references in this series. And I don't know if people who even like this series are aware of this. I met Mark Millar once, and this is the last nice thing I'll say about the man. I met him once and I said that to him. I was like, there's all these like really, really specific kind of shorthand references to the movies in that series. Were you intentionally doing this, or is it just something that you kind of, they were in the back of your mind, you just sort of subconsciously put them in? And he's like, no, they were all intentionally put in there and you're the very first person to notice, which I thought was nice. No, that can't be true, but he did say that to me, so I thought that was nice.
Well, it's interesting. I wonder, clearly this has found its audience now, or maybe the people tweeting about it now grew up reading it. But I wonder at the time when this was coming out, if maybe it was largely being consumed by a younger audience, and maybe some of those references didn't totally land. So either he was just being nice to you, or maybe, I suppose I could see that. Yeah, there are definitely a few that stand out. For example, in the two-parter where Clark ends up on that alternate Earth, and Jonathan and Martha have died, and he's at their grave, and the line about all this power, all these things I can do, and I couldn't save them.
Yes.
Straight out of Superman the movie. Also, Millar's use of Brad Wilson. He pops up in not one, but two issues. One of which is a flashback. And another one is this really significant issue where he comes to Metropolis and reveals to Clark that he knows he's Superman and blackmails him. And it's this crazy thing. Now, it's a slightly different interpretation of Brad Wilson. He's not this kind of drunken fool. Like, he's kind of a criminal mastermind in it. Well, yeah, he's got all of this broadcast know-how, and he's beaming out all of these messages that only Clark can see and hear with his enhanced senses. And it's making Clark think he's going crazy because he's seeing all of these messages. Like, I know you're Superman. And no one else sees it. That was one of my favorite issues. Not so much because of the pull from the movies, although that's cool to see that character utilized. But I really liked the notion. It rang so true that at least one person from Smallville would see Superman on the news and be like, guys, that's Clark. That's Clark.
And I love that everyone in Smallville thought he was crazy as well, which was even funnier.
Yeah. So that was a fun one.
There was one line in that really made me laugh. There was a line where Brad was kind of outlining his evil scheme, and he said that he was working in these dead-end jobs or something like that, and he was determined to make some real money like his nemesis Clark Kent was making as a journalist in Metropolis. And I was kind of like, on the one hand, I was like, journalists don't make that much money. Like, trust me, I work in an adjacent industry. I know. But then on the other hand, I was like, well, hang on a sec. In Superman, the animated series, Lois drives what looks like a Porsche and Clark drives what looks like a Ferrari. So maybe they do make a lot of money.
It's true. It changes with the times. We talk about this when we do our George Reeves Adventures of Superman episodes, where I always marvel at the expense accounts that these reporters must have, and just the budget that the paper has to send a trio of reporters on a plane, put them up in hotels to cover all these stories. So I don't know. At this point in time in the late 90s, I think it's changed even more now. I wouldn't expect that now.
Clark drives that sexy, that convertible in the George Reeves series as well. The one that I think Tony Mannix gave George Reeves in real life. It was his actual car.
Oh, I didn't know that bit of trivia.
That might be fan speculation. I remember reading that somewhere at one point that it was his actual car driving it and that Tony Mannix might have given it to him. But now don't hold me to that. But I thought that was fun.
That is interesting. But yeah, that Brad. No, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
No.
I was going to say, I have actually written down some of the other kind of really sort of tiny Donner, what I suspect are references to those movies. There's a bit where I think one of the very first issues that Millar wrote, there's a bit where there's a plane about to crash and it says, Metropolis Tower, this is Lex Air 3. Just feels faintly reminiscent of Metropolis Tower, this is Air Force One. There's a bit where Jonathan calls Martha Clark Kent, which obviously Glenn Ford says in the movie. There's another bit where someone says, Control, we got a Miss Lane here, which again happens in Superman the movie. There's another bit where someone says, that man's a miracle, which happens in Superman 3. And then there's another bit where someone says, if only you gotten here a minute sooner, which again happens in Superman 3. And then Brad Wilson's in it. So all of those lines are just, if you've watched those movies as many times as I have, if you read them somewhere, you're like, okay, that's got to be a reference. They're so specific and they're surrounded by these other things that are obviously references. So that I think it was the Control, we got a Miss Lane here that I brought up with Mark Millar when I met him one time. I was like, is that a rep? And he was like, yeah, no, it is. And you're the first person to notice. So I can confirm that he did consciously put them in there.
Listen, man.
Oh, and there's another one where someone refers to his dense molecular structure.
Honestly, hats off to you because you picked up on way more than I did. A lot of those, I feel like there's some deep cuts there, but I've not
deep cuts.
But that's the thing. To your point, if you know those movies like the back of your hand, yeah, I'm sure those stand out. Oh, that's great. No, there were, like I said, a number of those did not land with me, so I appreciate you listing them.
Do you know what it is as well? I think when you grow up on this side of the world, you have less access to American comics and American cartoons sometimes. Like, I definitely watched Superman the Animated Series. It wasn't like, I saw it on its first run, and then I don't really know if it was like rerun constantly or anything like that. Same thing with Lois and Clark. I never saw the George Reeves show until I got the DVDs. So really the movies were the most accessible form of Superman media, and a lot of people would just get them and rewatch them again and again and again. I feel like Grant Morrison has said that as well. And they would have had a similar experience growing up in Scotland as a friend and later a foe of Mark Millar. So I think, and it's the same with the Batman movies. It's like, those are the only things that you could really just get your hands on and have all forever, you know? So it would make sense that he would watch those movies. And I think he would have been about 10 when Superman 3 came out. So, and that was like the dawn of home video and all that sort of stuff. So it would make sense if he grew up with those movies, and then when he got into comics, he was just regurgitating the dialogue.
Totally. No, that's an interesting point though about growing up overseas and having that as that primary delivery mechanism. So out of these 20 or so that we read, were there any that especially jumped out at you as stories that you would have loved to have seen as actual episodes of the animated series?
Yes, I would say, I mean, I can talk about my favorite issues, but I don't necessarily know. You mentioned the 22 stories in one issue. I don't necessarily think that would make a great cartoon episode. There was one issue 27, Taking Care of Business, which is just a really Lex-centric story where, spoiler warning, he basically kidnaps Metallo and reprograms him to become this hero called Superior Man who takes all the attention away from Superman. And then Superman finds out that it's actually Metallo and they have a big fight. And then he confronts Lex and basically calls him out. And it's like, you have all this money and all this power and you just waste it by trying to destroy the world. What's wrong with you? And we get this absolutely beautiful moment where Lex has this moment where he's talking to Mercy and he says something to the effect of, I've spent $8 billion trying to destroy him in the last financial year, 10 hours every day devising death traps. What have I accomplished? Absolutely nothing. And it's one of my favorite Lex Luthor moments ever. And that issue, for that reason, I wish that was an actual episode. Other ones that just in terms of being kind of kick-ass fun stories, there's a Brainiac one earlier in Mark Millar's run that I think would have been really, really strong. Where it's like Brainiac and then Livewire turns up and they have a fight. And it was a two-parter. It was really, really well done. And then there was another one where Superman goes to an alternate version of Krypton in an alternate universe. And he has to team up with Jor-El to stop Lara. And I thought that was really, really cool. Those two, I thought, especially would have made some great episodes. And then there's just a litany of really, really good Mr. Mxyzptlk ones. There's one, we were talking about Superboy off mic. There's an issue where Mr. Mxyzptlk, in a bid to kind of defeat or destroy Superman, he goes back in time to Smallville, convinces Clark to become Superboy, and then convinces him to go to the moon because he shows him this fake future where Superman becomes a despotic kind of a dictator type and destroys the world, basically. And he convinces Clark that if he doesn't banish himself to the moon, that this will come to pass. So Clark willfully just travels off the moon. I think that would have been a cool episode. Maybe a little bit silly, I think. But I thought that one was fun. And then, what was the other one I liked? Issue 36 I have down as well. Issue 36. Now, I have a pretty big problem with this issue, but I do think it would have made a good episode overall. It starts with a little boy who's lost his dog, and he's heartbroken about this. And his parents are, he starts literally praying to Superman that Superman brings his dog back, and his parents are going, no, never going to happen. Come on, Superman's got a million things to do. And then we cut to this sort of montage of Superman out and about, solving all these other problems and, stopping all these criminals. And he stops some extremists in a plane at one point, and I want to get back to that. And he's doing all these things, and I think he fights supervillains at one stage. And then at the end of the issue, we see the boy reunited with his dog. And he says to his parents that he left the window open all night, and Superman must have brought his dog back. And his parents are like, what? No, that's not possible, is it? And the little boy goes, sure it is, because he's Superman. And I just thought that was a really, really lovely moment. And that kind of thing I would have loved to have seen a little bit more of, just that sort of whimsy and belief in heroes and that sort of just magic. I think that would have been really lovely in the series. I think all of those ones kind of would have made good episodes.
Those are some great picks. I would really co-sign on most, if not all of them. I definitely think that two-parter with the alternate universe where Superman is helping Hamilton with that antimatter engine and it blows up and he finds himself on that parallel Earth. That was particularly interesting. I mean, certainly the animated series delved into that already, but this was actually surprisingly dark when you get into the business about, as you said, Lara leading this attack against Earth and had brainwashed the Clark and Kara of that Earth. And the fact that Jor-El is ultimately the one who's resisting this and effectively kills all of the Kryptonians in order to stop them and to send Clark back to his Earth. It's funny because that's when I talk about kind of enjoying these issues to a point, one of the things that I think I bump up against is that even though it's not strictly a kid's comic, it's an all ages comic, and there's only so much depth or nuance that they can get into. But this was one that I was really kind of surprised by how dark it went. I mean, I feel like that ending would have had to have been softened for television if they had actually done that. But that was one that definitely stood out.
Yeah. How did you feel about the Superior Man one, by the way, the Lex one?
I like that a lot. That was actually funny enough. That was the one issue of the series I had read previously when we did some Lex-centric episodes a couple of years ago. And that was one of the ones that is always cited on best Lex Luthor stories. How much can one man hate? And I thought that was very interesting for all the reasons that you cited. And kind of on a similar note, and one that I actually would have liked to have seen as an episode as well, Millar's last issue, number 52, where Supergirl is suffering from this Kryptonian virus. And in order to create an antidote, Superman needs Element X, which called to mind Virus X from the pre-crisis comics. So that was kind of cool. And just this whole business about Lex claiming that he's created the element, but refusing to give it to Superman unless Superman exposes himself to Metallo's kryptonite and dies. And Superman has this tearful farewell with Supergirl. And when the tear drops down onto her, she's cured because the salt in his tears, that's this mysterious element X.
Love it.
But then the kicker at the end of the story, this idea that Lex had not actually created the element after all. So all that bluster about I've done it, but I'm not giving it to you unless you kill yourself. He hadn't even done it, but Superman was able to still save the day and figure it out and beat him, as Lex says, intellectually, which is the one area where Lex always still considers himself to be superior. I thought that was, I agree with you, man. Those two issues in particular, 27 and 52, the two Lex-centric issues of this were real standouts. And those were two that I definitely would have loved to have seen on the show.
I mentioned earlier, by the way, that I had read exactly one of these as a child because my brother had the issue, and it was that issue. It was the Supergirl virus one. So I'm glad to, and I didn't even know kind of that was a Mark Millar issue until I kind of came back to this and realized going back through them, you know. I just want to point out as well, Anthony, that in the when it gives you the genetic breakdown of this virus or the vaccination or whatever it is, the readout is very similar to Superman 3 when Gus looks up the chemical components of kryptonite and there's element unknown or whatever. It reminded me of that. Maybe it was a reference, maybe it wasn't.
Given everything else that we've already cited, I'm sure it is. We still have more specific issues to reference here, but another big picture question, did these issues satisfy the quote unquote voice test? As you were reading these, did you hear Tim Daly and Dana Delaney and Clancy Brown?
I would say I definitely heard Clancy Brown. Yes. I mean, it was hard not to, like, especially in that issue I was talking about and that specific monologue. What have I accomplished? Absolutely nothing. Like, you can just hear Clancy Brown's kind of monotone. And, you know, I should say, controversially, he's not even necessarily my favorite Lex Luthor, but I think his voice does reverberate through pretty much any Lex Luthor story ever written after he played the character. And you can hear it in comics and you can definitely hear it in these ones. Superman-wise, sometimes I'm hearing Tim Daly. You know, sometimes I feel like the dialogue is written to be more kind of Christopher Reevey, and I'm not hearing Tim Daly. And I love Tim Daly. I just think the material he was given and the kind of direction they took the character in that series, you know, they didn't do anything really with the secret identity, in stark contrast to Batman the Animated Series and other Superman stuff. And I think they really toned down the kind of gutsy, all-American sort of, you know, you could say corny speeches that Superman would make in other stuff, to its detriment, I think. And so, whereas I think this comic dials a lot of that stuff up, and there's a lot of kind of one-liners and a lot more humor and stuff. So there were times where I was kind of hearing more sort of Christopher Reeve type voice from Superman. In terms of Lois and everyone else, I'm not sure that they really featured enough for me to hear voices other than the ones they had in the series. Maybe Perry White, actually, because this Perry White was a lot closer. First of all, he appears in this comic way more than he ever appeared in the show, and he's far more verbose, and he says Great Caesar's Ghost a lot more, which I don't think he ever said in the cartoon. So I was kind of hearing this sort of John Hamilton version from the George Reeves series more so than, I don't know, I think the Scarface guy played him in the animated series, did he? The guy who played Scarface in Batman also played...
Oh, actually, I don't know offhand.
Perry White?
We'll have to double check.
Yeah, I don't even know the actor's name. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I would say I agree with that. I mean, I think overall, and especially initially I was hearing them, I agree. I think as we got deeper into it, especially with Superman, maybe deviated a little bit. But overall, like I said, it definitely, for me, captured the spirit of the show. And, you know, we haven't mentioned the art, but the art obviously goes a long way towards that. And you're reading these issues, and it definitely is in that style of the animated series, those Bruce Timm designs. So that helps plant you in that world.
I have to say, the art, going back to what we were talking about earlier on about it being a tie-in product and all that kind of thing, the art was definitely something that turned me off as a kid because, you know, like that, when I went to the comic shop as a kid and it was this big event, I wanted to get the real 100% authentic DC comic Superman, which would have been the mullet Superman at that time. I didn't want this tie-in product for this familiar thing that I already knew. And then reading them years later, I was kind of like, well, I love the way these are written, but I wish the art didn't tie into the series because I just wish these stood on their own. And I do still feel like that a little bit. And that's not, again, not to disrespect the series. I feel like, maybe these would stand out a little bit more if the art was completely unique. But going back to them this time, I was like, well, no, leaving aside the character designs, the actual art and the way it's implemented and the way the panels are designed, some of them are incredible, and a lot of the issues are penciled by this guy, Allure Alancio, I think. And I looked him up and he's an actual storyboard artist on Superman the Animated Series and a bunch of other subsequent cartoons for Warner Brothers and other companies and stuff like that. And some of his panels are just gorgeous. And you can see there's Jack Kirby influences in there. And there's this villain in Superman Adventures called Multi-Face.
Yeah.
Who I think he might be an existing villain. I'm not really sure. I looked him up and I couldn't really find anything on him. But there was a couple of panels where he's kind of this chameleon-like guy. He's like the chameleon from Spider-Man. He can just assume people's identities, and he has this really cool sort of Jack Kirby-esque design. And there's this one panel where he's talking about how he can impersonate any of Superman's friends, and there's all these faces behind him. And it reminded me of that, I think it was a John Romita Spider-Man cover, where it's like, which one of Spider-Man's family will die? You know that one I'm talking about?
Yeah.
It was just a lovely callback. There's loads of great artwork in this, and I don't think I ever really sort of gave it the time it deserved when I was reading these before.
When we mentioned before that issue 41 with the 22 single-page stories, first of all, I agree with you. That's one that I don't think would work as an animated episode, and that's a great thing because that shows you what you can do with the comic book form. But, of course, we have the credits for each issue in that. And one of the pages was drawn by Darwin Cook, the late, great Darwin Cook. And I had no idea that he had ever done anything with this series. And I was so happy when I got to that page and I saw that was done by him. So that was a nice little unexpected treat.
Do you remember which page was done by him? Because I was looking out for him, and I think I got so engrossed in the issue that I stopped looking for him.
I think it was a Toyman page.
Okay,
I'm almost positive it was Toyman. But that was a nice little treat to see that. One of the issues, I'll be honest, it was not one of my favorites. I didn't hate it, but it is one that I think certainly could have worked very well as an animated series episode. And it's the one where Superman and Jimmy switch bodies.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And Superman in Jimmy's body ends up imprisoned on Apocalypse, and Jimmy in Superman's body has to rescue him. It's funny because, of course, by the time we get to Justice League Unlimited, we get that classic episode, The Great Brain Robbery, where Lex and Flash switch bodies. But
I have no idea who this is.
Exactly. So that was one that I said, oh, man, that would have been really cool as an episode. As an issue, it was solid. I was happy to see Jimmy get some play. But that was one that I thought about as that would be a really cool one. The Brad Wilson one, I don't know how well that would have lent itself to the show itself, but for the reasons we talked about, I love it. The other thing too is the Brad Wilson of it all doesn't do a ton for me. I appreciate the reference, but I think for me, the reason I like it, I love Conduit, the Kenny Braverman character from the 90s. Yes. And very much in that vein, I mean, Brad Wilson doesn't go the route of becoming a full-fledged supervillain. The opposite, actually, and I thought this was a really nice touch, the fact that you see Superman's compassionate side. He actually sets Brad up with a job at Wayne Industries through Bruce. So kind of sets him on the right path, and I thought that was a nice touch. But as I'm reading this, just this idea of someone from his past in Smallville taunting him with this knowledge that he knows his secret. It's like, this is Conduit. So I liked it for that especially.
Kenny Braverman showed up in a flashback episode, didn't he? In the time travel Brainiac one he was in, and he was basically that character. He was the bully, the kind of class bully guy.
Yeah.
So it would have made as much sense if they made him that character in this. But then I suppose you're writing Conduit out of it then.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I think Mixie did get a fair amount of play in these issues.
My goodness. I think I read more Mix's Pitlick stories in this crop of issues than I've read in the last decade.
I feel like Millar really stuck to the every 90 days. I mean, it wasn't that frequent, but I think there was sort of this thing of like, okay, this is going to become a recurring bit. The first issue that Millar wrote, in fact, number 16, features Mixie, and the opening of it was reminiscent to me of the first Bizarro episode from the show, where Clark is there and then he sees Superman, and there's this huge moment of confusion. Certainly in this Mixie issue, it goes far beyond that, where Mixie has, of course, rewritten reality and has taken Superman's place, and no one, including Jonathan and Martha, knows that Clark is Superman. He doesn't have his powers, and of course, he has to trick Mixie as he always does. But I thought that was a fun start. I did think the Superboy, quote unquote Superboy issue was interesting. From the cover, I thought we were going to get more Superboy. I thought it was going to go in a different direction as opposed to what we got, which you had explained earlier, of Mixie tricking young Clark into thinking that he becomes this dictator, and the only way around it is to sequester himself on the moon. I did like the payoff to that, though, where in the present, of course, time is a mess, and everyone's far worse off than they would have been with Superman there. And Mixie's bored because there's no one there to challenge him, and so he has to go back and undo what he did. So I thought that was, again, it didn't follow the track that I thought it would, but I enjoyed it overall. Yeah.
I especially like the final page of that issue as well, where it's Clark talking to Jonathan and Martha, and I think at the start of the story, he's been kind of frustrated with the fact that he wants to show his powers to the world and he wants to get out there, like in so many Superman sort of Smallville type scenarios. And in the end, in the final page of the story, he says to Jonathan and Martha, actually, you know what? I think you're right. I think I am too young to take on that kind of responsibility. The world doesn't need a Superboy. The world needs a Superman. And I thought, like, that was really, it was, you know, because we were probably still in the era where there was probably a lot of people going, bring back Superboy. What the hell? Why'd you get rid of why'd you get rid of that facet of the character? And that's Mark Millar basically putting it on the page that, no, I really believe in that change, and I really admire and respect it. And I thought that was cool. Yeah. And there's that lovely moment where I think either Jonathan or Clark draws a sketch of the Joe Shuster original design of Superman. It's like, this is what I have in mind.
Yeah, that was a nice touch, where the night before Jonathan is half asleep, but he sees out the window young Clark in the costume flying to the moon, and then he wakes up and he has that idea and sketches it out. Yeah, I know, it was kind of an interesting statement about the place or lack thereof of Clark as Superboy. What I like too is how, and I think this issue is a good example of how it fits within the continuity of the show. This places young Clark at this point after he's discovered his origins, but of course before he's embarked, before he's finished school and embarked on the journey that will take him to Metropolis. So, an instance of sort of filling in some of those gaps, which I thought was neat. What did you think about issue 29, the Lobo and Bizarro episode, where Lobo brings Bizarro back to Earth from the planet where Clark had set him up?
I did read it. I'm kind of drawing a blank on it a little bit. That was 29, was it?
29. That's the one where Bizarro wants Lois as his wife.
Yes.
And he ends up creating essentially Bizarro Lois. And there's this moment of confusion where it seems like he's essentially killed Lois by turning her into this. And then, of course, it turns out that's not the case. He's just created this duplicate. But the thing about it that was weird to me was the Bizarro Lois he creates can't think or speak or move.
Ooh.
So it's like, honestly, it was like he created a Bizarro Lois sex doll. Like, it was weird. It was weird. No. And I was saying to myself, why not allow her to to speak?
Yeah.
To actually have a personality.
It's so interesting that you're bringing this up. I'm just skimming through it here. I'm remembering it better and better now. And there's a panel actually. Sorry to dovetail into fan service here. There's a panel earlier on in the issue where it definitely looks like they drew the writer's room of Superman the Animated Series, cosplaying as Superman at some sort of convention. I think you see Bruce Timm there and what looks to be Paul Dini. Don't really recognize the rest. Alan Burnett might be one of them as well. I thought that was fun. No, just a comment. There's a Superboy episode where this happens, and I think it handles it a lot better than this comic. Bizarro Lex makes a Bizarro doppelganger of his girlfriend Darla for Bizarro to go out with, and they don't get along at all. And then in the final moments of the episode, a Bizarro Lana is created because it's Lana in that show, not Lois, and they live happily ever after. So, and they go back to Bizarro World, and she is a sentient creature and all this kind of stuff. So it's handled a lot more gracefully than this. Now, I don't think he was referencing the Superboy show. But no, that's interesting. No, do you know what? Reading it, I don't think it even occurred to me that she couldn't speak, or she was just sort of standing there. So that is a bit weird and creepy. All right.
Yeah. Sorry, that's where my mind went. Not to be crass, but it's just like, what is he going to do with this being that he's created? So yeah, I thought that was a lot. Oh, but as far as sort of other references, I believe it's in that issue where, oh, right, because Bizarro doesn't want to leave Earth, right, because he thinks Superman needs help, and Superman tricks him into thinking that all of those people dressed up in the Superman costume are they actually have powers and they're the Superman emergency squad. So I thought that was a nice touch.
That's great.
The pre-crisis, Kandor stories. So yeah, I thought that was a cool one. Oh, going back to issue 36, the one where Superman is just saving everyone, right? Performing all of these rescues over the course of the night, culminating in returning the dog to the young child. Yeah, it definitely jumped out when we dealt with this business about political extremists hijacking a plane. And this was, by the time that issue comes out, I mean, where are we? We're late 90s, right? I think that was 99 or so.
99, actually 99 specifically. And I looked up what year it was because I wanted to make a point about that. And it's nothing to do with 9/11 or anything like that, but it just, something really, really hit me with reading that panel. What stood out to you about that sort of sequence and that moment?
Oh, no, I mean, it just made me think of 9/11. What jumped out at you?
So they're political extremists, right? And they've hijacked a plane, and Millar goes to pains to sort of say, now, finally the world will notice what we're fighting for, and if it takes the deaths of all these people to do it, then so be it, or something. You're kind of like, this is a little bit much straight away. Then Superman arrives, and he says something to the effect of, "I stopped listening as soon as you took your guns out," which, I don't know, but okay. But then there's this moment later on when he's sort of apprehended the terrorists, and one of them makes the point where they're like, "What's wrong with you, Superman? Like, why won't you listen to us or something? Or don't you understand that we're fighting for a cause?" I think he says, or something like that. And Superman bonks him on the head, knocking him out, and says, "Politics were never my thing." And I don't know. I have this, like, if you're trying to quote unquote keep the politics out of it, then keep the politics out of it. By saying something like "politics were never my thing," you're politicizing it. And this is like, I looked up the year specifically because this was very close to the year that Jerry Siegel himself died. And Jerry Siegel, when he created Superman, he created him as a champion of the working class. There are some incredibly political Superman stories written by Jerry Siegel. Not long after that, he went up against the KKK in the radio show. Superman is a political character, and if he was ever depoliticized, it was later on. It wasn't, so and I suppose what particularly surprises me now is Mark Millar in recent times has become a very strange man in various different ways that I don't want to get into. But one of his big things that he likes to shout and roar about on Twitter is cancel culture. And to me, claiming that Superman is not a political character is in itself a form of cancellation. So what the hell? I don't know. I totally understand if you want to just keep the problems of the real world out of your Superman comic for kids. By all means, do that. In the cartoon, there's an episode where Superman goes up against terrorists in the world's finest crossover episode. They get around the problems of the real world by just making them kind of generic Hans Gruber-esque white Americans. That's what you do there. And you don't mention anything about, because I don't know. It's a problem I come up against a lot with Superman stuff. Is it sort of depends on the politics of the writer, and sometimes I don't think Superman is necessarily the character you use to tackle these problems, because it just opens up a whole other can of worms about what Superman should and shouldn't be doing in the world. And anyway, it just really bothered me, that line. I've never been political. It's like, what? You're a journalist. Like, what's that about? It didn't make any sense, and it just really bothered me. And I need to basically say that I really disregard a lot of what Mark Millar comes out with today, and a lot of his subsequent works, where it feels like he's just being an edgelord for the sake of it sometimes. And I think something like this, which is a kid's comic where he was probably working under the constraints of, it needing to be fun for kids and family friendly, maybe that was a good thing, that kind of way. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about that.
No, that's fair enough. And look, this episode is not, I didn't do this to be to put forth a celebration of the man, but these issues again are part of the lore, and we've heard a lot about them over the years, and I wanted to explore them. And just in terms of this comic creator's work, again, I think it hits at an interesting time in his career, and I've always kind of been curious about it. As far as, since we're on this note of things that maybe bothered us, this is on a far, far lighter note, but Parasite gets a bit of play here in these issues. And there's, it's the first issue that he appears in, issue 24, where once again steals Superman's powers and whatnot. But he kidnaps this woman, and it seems like they have some sort of romantic history. And then it turns out after Superman rescues her, she's like, what is she, like an acupuncturist or a fortune teller or something?
Crystal healing. Yeah, she's one of these kind of new age hippie type crystal healer people. Yeah, just nonsense.
and after Superman rescues her, the twist, so to speak, is she reveals that she hasn't seen Rudy Jones since they were in 3rd grade. And
yeah, that was stupid.
The thing that I guess bugged me a little bit about it is I'm thinking back to Rudy's appearances in the show. This felt out of character. I mean, that's pretty unhinged, right? To have imagined this completely non-existent relationship. It's just, that did not line up with what I think the show presented as far as the character. That I was kind of put off by that because it felt kind of out of nowhere.
I agree. I actually thought the foundation was there to tell a really interesting story that was much more of a kind of this tragic character study. But then they just sort of flush it down the toilet by saying, oh no, he never actually knew her after all. And he imagined all this in his head. I thought, no, that was just silly. It was as if they ran out of pages to sort of flesh it out properly. And they had to just say, oh no, it was all a dream, you know?
Maybe. Then there's another one later on where Parasite steals Mixia-Spitalik's powers. Now, that's one of those ones kind of like Jimmy and Superman switching bodies and going to Apocalypse. Not at the top of my list in terms of what I love from these issues, but I could definitely see it as an episode of the show and is kind of a sort of a fun matchup here of taking these two adversaries and doing something. And of course, it calls to mind, to me, the Emperor Joker story from the Jeff Loeb, Joe Ellie era of the comics. Certainly Parasite doesn't go as far as Joker did in that, but I thought that was an interesting jumping off point.
I definitely enjoyed that issue. The only thing that was kind of like gnawing at my nerd brain was I feel like Parasite's powers shouldn't work that way. Like, as in, he shouldn't be able to steal a magic man's, like, magic shouldn't have anything to do with this very science-based character, you know, like, in a way. And it's that classic kind of wish for more wishes problem where, you know, he's still the parasite, so his Mixia-Spitalik powers run out after 3 days. Did it never occur to him to just change that and just give himself unlimited power? But I don't know. That's a really small nitpick, but it just sort of stood out to me. It was like, does Parasite's powers work that way? That you can just steal magic? But, you know, who cares?
Honestly, though, I agree. Especially to your first point, where the magic was treated just like any other electricity or energy. Yeah. And it's like, nah, it is different. So I guess you got to get past that to enjoy that issue. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting one. What have we not talked about from these issues that you wanted to?
Jeepers, I think we've kind of. Oh, the Batgirl issue I thought was fun. I liked that, and I thought anytime Batman showed up in this, I really liked it. It didn't feel like it was underserving kind of Superman, or that he was kind of taking the main stage in any way. I thought it was just a really nice extension of the way they characterized their sort of frenemy-ship on the actual show. I thought it was really, really nice. And the Batgirl issue was great because Batman is in it, but he's sort of captured for the whole thing, and he has to team up with Batgirl. And there's this great scene in it. Going back to the point I was making about the humor, it was a scene that felt maybe a touch goofier than something you would have seen in the actual Superman the Animated Series, but I thought it was great for this comic, where Batgirl is doing the Batgirl thing, and she's interrogating all these goons, and Superman barges in, and Batgirl just kind of lets out this weary sigh, like, "Oh, you've set us back by 20 minutes," and he's like, "Why? What are you talking about?" And the gangster's like, "Well, here, Supes, let me demonstrate," and he proceeds to start shooting the other mobsters, and Superman catches all the bullets, and the mobster's like, "See? You've just proven why, you know, you can't question us because we know you're not going to hurt us and you're not going to let us die." So, you know, and so they basically just arrest them and don't question them. And Superman, over the course of the issue, has to learn to be more like Batman. And you see this other scene where he like flies a guy up in front of a plane until he gets the information he wants, and then he gets it. And then when he's flying back, he's talking to Batgirl, and he's like, "I hated myself for doing that." And I thought that was nice. Not really quite in tune with the type of thing they do on the cartoon, I don't think. But I thought it worked really nicely in that comic.
That was fun. The one thing though in that issue when he's talking to Gordon on the roof and then he disappears just like Batman does.
Oh yeah.
And Gordon has a crack like, what is it with these guys? But I don't know that Superman would do that. I feel like
I thought the same.
I feel like there would have been some sort of farewell. So I don't know that totally tracked for me. But the last, I suppose, big picture question I have, and I could probably, I think I know what the answer would be, even for myself, but I still want to pose the question. I think one of the charms of this series is that it does feel like it fits in with the animated show, even though some of them do veer off a bit. But overall, and like we said, there are a number in particular that really, it would have been so cool to see as animated episodes. Is there any part of you, though, that would have wanted to see this series delve into territory that the show wasn't built for? Like, for example, when we talk about the Smallville season 11 comic, and I still remain a little split on this, but I know one of the reasons a lot of people seem to love the Smallville season 11 comic is that you get to see Clark fully fledged as Superman, and you get to see Batman and a lot of stuff that the show just wouldn't or couldn't show you. Would you have wanted this to do anything similar?
Well, I suppose the main thing for me that's absent from the Superman the Animated Series that is like a core part of nearly every other version of Superman ever is that the love story between him and Lois is largely like, it's not even secondary. It's like a distant third element that's barely in the show at all. And they never really develop it at all. And it feels like such a missed opportunity. And yet, like, they could absolutely do that in a comic. They never really even do it in Justice League either. They kind of just skip to it and say, hey, look, they're dating now, or I guess, I'd love to see that explored with this particular world, these particular versions of the characters. And, you could absolutely do that in a comic. And it's strange that they never have, because they keep doing stuff with Batman, the animated series, but we never really get anything with Superman. So I think that's definitely something they could do.
I agree, man. That was the big thing for me too. I would have loved to have seen something like that. I would have loved to have seen, I feel like the show itself maybe could only go so far, but still could have done more than it did. And certainly the comic. That's the one thing for me too, as well. But look, now we're in an age we have My Adventures with Superman. It's built around this, this budding romance between them. So it's all good. Listen, this was a lot of fun. I appreciate you taking the time to read and discuss these. It was really blessed.
Thanks so much. And it was kind of a great excuse to do that. I was kind of shocked by how many there were. I didn't remember him writing quite as many as he did, but it was great to go back to so many of them. And I really dig them, and I recommend anyone that likes Superman. If someone is just looking for a quick blast of Superman, there's a couple of really, really good ones here that are worth checking out, and you'll read them very quickly. For sure. And I know I complain about the DC app a lot for its omissions, but they're all on the DC app. They are out there, and they've also been collected in various forms as well, but they're all on the app. And yeah, if you have not read any of these and any of the ones that we talked about, if they seem interesting to you, one of the nice things about this, like we said, you could just jump in, read a random issue, and see for yourself. So the All-Star Superfan podcast, where would you like to direct folks? What would you like to share about the show? We have a couple of things in the pipeline. One big interview I'm really excited about coming up very soon. Recently, we did something kind of different where we took a break from Superman and we discussed the RoboCop franchise in detail, because the game came out recently. We were both playing the game. We just wanted to talk about RoboCop, so you can check that out. There's loads of other cool episodes we've done recently. Lots of comic stuff, lots of interviews, lots of movie stuff. We did an episode with Zach Moore and Oliver Harper where we talked about the ultimate cut of Superman 2, and we got your take on that in the following episode. So that there's loads of fun stuff you can go back and check out, and we've got great episodes coming out as well soon. My thanks to both Rob and Daniel for joining me on this double feature. Thank you to the audience as always for tuning in, and make sure you come back next week for our milestone 150th episode and the start of a brand new fan journey. Don't miss it. Until then, as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. Be sure to check out our sister podcast series, Another Exciting Episode in the Adventures of Superman, an episode-by-episode breakdown of the classic George Reeves television show, available wherever you get podcasts. Please join us on social media, become a patron, and subscribe, rate, and review today. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all.